Okay, can you ask everyone to mute themselves, please? Or except Amy, of course. You are most welcome to our event. This is part of the LGBT History Month. And LGBT History Month is about claiming our past, celebrating our present, and creating our future. So Amy Jeffries Finlay is one of our heritage LGBT Heritage Project volunteers, and she has a book coming out which is Space in Irish Lesbian Fiction, and we're delighted that she has agreed to do this talk for us tonight. So Amy, over to yourself.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here this evening, and I feel like I've talked about this book quite a lot, but a few people have come back to hear even more, so I'm absolutely delighted that you're not sick of hearing about it. So yes, my book is called Space and Irish Lesbian Fiction Towards a Queer Liminality. And needless to say, I never thought I would write a book with a title like that. Life is full of surprises. I always hoped I would write a book because I loved reading, I loved English. I studied English for a very, very long time. But I'd never thought that this would be the output of all those years of studying. Excuse me. So I thought I would try to sort of contextualize this a little bit. Sometimes books get published and people are like, oh my goodness, how on earth did this book come into being? So I thought I would do a little timeline. And it's been interesting for me to do this timeline as well, because it's sort of taken me back over the past 2 years and just thinking about sort of the ups and downs of research and writing and meeting the lovely people on the LGBT Heritage Project, of course, as well. So I was incredibly lucky in that my PhD, which I completed at Queen's, was funded. I was so lucky in that regard because I think even since that time, PhD funding in the arts has been dramatically reduced. So I was very, very fortunate. I did my PhD on Irish writers, and I suppose at the time I was a young idealistic feminist. I thought that I could see Molly laughing at that. Molly, maybe you also relate to that. I was a young idealistic feminist. I was very interested in feminism and in Irish studies. That was my background. And that was sort of the area I gravitated to as well. So my interest in particularly lesbian writing, I suppose, grew out of that, because if you think about how Irish society has been so patriarchal and typified by men, a lesbian in a way was the pinnacle of this anti-patriarchy moment. You know, a lesbian doesn't need a man. And that's how I sort of got interested in this. I think that is a bit of a naive way to think about it. But as I said, I was a lot younger and idealistic back then. Maybe I'm too cynical now. So anyway, I completed this research in about 4 years on and off. And I was very lucky in that I did a placement at Care Friend as well, which obviously supports the LGBT youth in Northern Ireland. Way back, excuse me, back in January 2020, I began planning on how I was going to publish this book, because I knew I wanted to publish it because I thought it was important. I thought the research was important, if that's not an arrogant thing to say. And of course, if you don't publish, you will perish in academia, because you don't get interviews without books, and that's just a fact. Well, it is in the arts anyway. So anyway, I began thinking, how was I going to publish this book? Then, as I was beginning to put it all together, the pandemic hit. And of course, it was obviously very difficult for everyone. But for me, everything shutting forced me to actually sit down and write the book. So in a way, it was quite a productive pandemic. And frustrating as well for obvious reasons. So in the summer of 2020, I contacted my first publisher, and I won't name them because they rejected the book. It got to very far. It got very far in the consideration, and then they said, actually, thanks, but no thanks. But sometimes when a door shuts, a window opens, and in the November of that year, Routledge decided they saw the value in the research, and they offered me a book contract, which I was absolutely delighted with, because Routledge are a better publisher than the first publisher. So that worked out for the best, I think. So obviously I had done a PhD, now I needed to turn it into the book. So all of last year, I basically wrote this book. So it was a very, very busy year, particularly the early parts of being locked up last year. The book's now coming out in June, all being well, because it's available for pre-release already, so it sort of has to come out in June. And hopefully there'll be a book launch, and if you want to come, you're all invited, and hopefully that will be in person as well. But in the midst of all of this, I had several job changes. One of the few people who can say they've worked in further education, higher education, and secondary education. I started publishing horror fiction as well, just on the side as a sort of byline to all of this. And I joined the LGBT Heritage Project, which has been brilliant personally, but also academically, because I think a lot of LGBT history, it's not in the books yet. It's not published yet. A lot of it is osmosis and from these sort of informal conversations. So I'm very grateful to have been involved in this project, for those reasons. So anyway, back in 2015, I wanted to go back 7 long years ago, and to contextualize this within the wider body of Irish studies. Well, even back then, there was hardly any research being done on Irish lesbian themes in specifically Irish literature. However, there was a growing body of research in LGBT themes at large. And I think that's testament to how things were really shifting within Irish studies at that time. Things like post-colonial theory obviously have been very trendy for a long time. Trauma theory was sort of sexy back in 2015. But there was a sort of growing interest in queer lives and queer themes. And you would occasionally get the odd lesbian article included, within that. So I just want to name some people who have been very influential in this field. And if anyone can add any more, this isn't an exhaustive list in case I'm leaving someone out, but I just want to sort of pinpoint these. So Moira Casey, she wrote a PhD dissertation on Irish lesbian fiction. It was very early, I think it was maybe 2003. So I was incredibly indebted to her. She's at the University of Miami now, and she sometimes writes on Emma Donoghue. Ed Madden at the University of South Carolina, and I was very lucky in that I got to go meet him at the Queer in Ireland conference back in 2017, which feels like a long time ago now. Michael Cronin, who's in Maynooth, and he writes a lot about queer space and temporality. So he's quite interesting, and he's got a book coming out on Irish LGBT writing as well. I think that's coming out later this year. So that's one, if you're interested, that's one to keep an eye on. Anne Mulhall at UCD as well, or University College Dublin. She was actually my external examiner. She writes a lot about like queerness and Irish culture, not just specifically lesbians. So in terms then of like an international lesbian historiography, I got very interested in the work of Lillian Federman. Her book was quite old, even back at the time when I was researching it, but it was incredibly useful record of sort of same-sex female relationships from the 18th, 19th, early 20th century, very, very influential scholar. And that's her book there. You can see you've got a little photo of it on the bottom right-hand side. And then she wrote another book called Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, which is just an amazing, more exciting title than the title of my book. And that was about American relationships between American women, lesbians in the kind of early to mid 20th century. Really, really interesting reading and very influential on my work. Emma Donoghue, again, who I write about in one of the later chapters of my book, she is also a historian of lesbian fiction as well. So she wears two hats as a writer, but also as a historian. And 1993, she wrote Passions Between Women, which was just a really, really influential book as well. So I'd highly recommend these. So that is just to sort of contextualize how this all came into being. So at that time, I got weirdly interested in the concept of space. And that's why I chose this sort of starry background for this PowerPoint. Of course, if you grew up in a Northern Irish context, you're probably more aware of the relationship between people and space, perhaps in other places. Needless to say, space is a sort of contested issue. And there was a lot of, I was interested in this, so I did a little bit more research, and I sort of discovered that there was an abundance of research which was examining the relationship between queer lives and spaces. So I'm thinking about the rise of like gay areas in certain cities, the relationship between pride and space and how that is sort of played out as well. A lot of this work then was quite almost created like a sort of dichotomy between urban and rural. So urban space has been very much associated with queer life. It's got a special relationship, as one scholar said, and that's always stuck with me. But there were also a lot of scholars who were questioning this and sort of saying there's been too much research being done on the relationship between urban space and LGBT life. You know, it's almost like rural LGBT lives have really been neglected. And that's something I got very, very interested in as well. So then I discovered Judith Halberstam's In a Queer Time and Place. And Halberstam is really sort of questioning these relationships between queerness and space. And they pay particular interest to rural space as well. And they take the story of Brandon Tina, who was a trans man who was killed and in like sort of middle America back in the late 80s, 90s, can't remember the exact date, but she was trying to examine this relationship between them. And I got really interested in that at that time. Halberstam doesn't mind also if you call them she or they go by sort of fluctuating titles. Judith's actually called Jack now, but again, I think they're kind of fluid. They've said they're fluid, so they don't really care actually what pronoun you use to refer to them. So out of this then, this just sounds like I've gone down this crazy rabbit hole, but I think anyone who does a PhD in these areas, they do sort of go down massive rabbit holes. But I got interested in this idea of the liminal space. And basically, the liminal space, it's from anthropology. And it's defined as this kind of space in between, this transitionary space, a season of waiting and not knowing. It's all very in between. I don't know why, but when I thought about this, I really started to get quite interested in the work of Mary Dorsey. Mary Dorsey was an Irish poet, writer, and activist in the 1970s. And she talks about life as a lesbian in the 1970s in rural communities. And she says, it was not in the light we lived, but in the space in between, in the darkness. So these ideas of being sort of half in the light, in this in-between space, it seemed very appropriate to this concept of liminality that I was keen to explore. If we also think about like the legal status of lesbians, lesbianism was never technically illegal in the same fashion as male homosexuality. And in a way, you can say that this was almost like a sort of erasure that they existed in a way, or that female sexuality wasn't as important or detrimental as male homosexuality. On another way, it offered a lot of freedom. So you could say the liminal space offers a certain freedom to exist sort of in between. So liminality is not always like a bad description, sometimes often very liberating and a very good description. So lesbians were not criminalized under the British Offences Against the Person Act of 1861 that remained enshrined in law following the formation of the independent Ireland. But far from signifying any radical acceptance of lesbian relationships, rather it functioned to further suppress and deny their existence in Irish society. So just continuing on with this idea of the liminal space then, this is Turner, who wrote a lot about this and really sort of pioneered the concept. I just want to qualify some of this. He was writing in the 1960s, so ideas about liminality have sort of progressed quite a lot since then, but these are just sort of the nuts and bolts of the idea. So he said, community members can be liminal as these persons elude or slip through the network of classifications that normally locate states and positions in cultural space. So that got me thinking really about how, so obviously lesbianism has never been technically illegal. For a long time, LGBTQ people couldn't get married. That's a very recent change. You think about that and you think about how this lack of like cultural validation in a way, how does that work? So there's just another sort of connection to like the liminal space in a way. He also says liminality is linked to death, to being in the womb, to invisibility, to darkness, to bisexuality, the wilderness, and an eclipse of the sun or the moon. Now, this all sounds very sort of esoteric. It almost sounds like I'm saying lesbians are in some sort of like sun moon dance or something. I really don't mean it to sound like that, but that's just the sort of the kind of pioneering ideas behind like the liminal space. Obviously, they can be contested. Turner also proposed that this idea could be applied to like physical locations, such as like places where there's like a merging, so like a river, shorelines, national borders, airports, this kind of in-between space as well. So this idea of being in between, it has long dominated Irish literature. I definitely am not the first person to be writing about liminality within Irish literature. So these scholars say that if interpreted as a concern with borders and states of in-betweenness, liminality is a widespread theme in Irish literature and culture. So now I've just realized that the position of where I can see you all on the screen is interfering with how I can read off my screen. So is there any way I can like move you? Maybe not.
Go to speaker view up in the top right hand corner. See where it says view?
No. No, I can't see it. Sorry, where did I click? Sorry.
If you're using a kind of laptop, it's up in the top right hand corner. It says view up at the top right of your screen.
Got like 9 little dots.
Is it beside mute? Like in the box where I am?
No, it's
no
up at the very top of the screen.
Okay, so I don't have that because
Do you
whatever
remember that?
way.
Do you read dots?
Yeah. Oh, here, I've been able to move you. I don't know how, but I've been able to move you. Is that okay? Can you still see my screen? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Sorry about that. That was just a nice break from all this liminal space. So anyway, that was how I got interested in the concepts of space, and particularly liminal space. And now you're thinking, what am I actually going to hear about the authors? We'll get to that very, very shortly. So I got back then when I was researching this, I started to get quite interested in like the 19th century, just because I've always had like a strong fascination with the Victorians, I guess. And I discovered this very interesting idea, sort of scientific thought called sexology. And it had a very interesting relationship to space as well. So basically, back in the sort of late 1800s, a lot of Victorian scientists got quite interested in sexology and, you know, things like nervous disorders in women, hysteria, beginning to think a lot about eugenics, think a lot about why some people would be not be straight, shall we say. And a lot of this thought is excuse me, not the most complimentary views, so I just need to sort of qualify that. So in Sexual Inversion, which was by English psychiatrist Havelock Ellis, came up with this sort of pioneering case book, and it was studies on like non-straight people, basically. It actually, when it first appeared, was banned as an obscene publication in Britain in 1989. So basically, he did a lot of studies on LGBT people, and at the time, basically, he was quite interested in particularly female homosexuality, which was called inversion. And at this time, sexual inversion was quite a pioneering theory in many ways, compared to a lot of thought about homosexuals. And he said that basically homosexuals were inverted men or women who were born into the incorrect gender, what we might now term as transgender. Inversion was sort of like an early prototype, I suppose, of that. He said that basically there were two types of inverts. So a woman or a girl, it was usually girls, a girl who was congenitally predisposed to homosexuality, and that they were going to be a lesbian regardless of, you know, what was going on. That was just in their nature. Another idea was that certain women could be turned lesbians in the right setting, in the right like space. They could change and turn into lesbians, but they're straight at their core. So that is just how lesbians were sort of thought of, basically, in the 19th century. And in this is obviously medical literature. So in Sexual Inversion, Ellis wrote that homosexuality is especially fostered on those employments which keep women in constant association, not only by day, but often at night also without the company of men. This is the case in convents. So he thought anywhere where there were large groups of women together, lesbianism could sort of grow and mutate like COVID, I suppose. You know, it could be transmitted between women. This idea became actually very, very popular, and a lot of research then at the 19th century began to look into this. So doctors began to discern homosexual elements in single-sex institutions such as convents, boarding schools, manufacturing establishments, and so forth. And these sort of crushes between women were often called smashes. And this was sort of studied, these sort of intense friendships between girls in schools were studied a lot, specifically in America and also in several European and Latin American countries. The term invert then was widely adopted in the following decades since its initial usage by sexologists. Stephen Gordon, who is in Radcliffe Hall's 1928, The Well of Loneliness, which we'll come back to later, is termed an invert throughout the text, and the first edition of the novel included a foreword written by Havelock Ellis. So Havelock Ellis, he really wanted to sort of understand lesbianism, and I know some of this sounds very, what's the word? Not flat, it's very unflattering to say that lesbians are like basically men, but he was coming from quite a understanding position, I might say, more so than a lot of the other medical literature at the time. So finally, within this backdrop, George Muir's work appeared, and George Muir was a Irish writer, and he was quite interested in the work of Havelock Ellis, very interested in the scientific rationale about lesbians. He was also very interested in French authors, and he did review quite a lot of French authors throughout his lifetime. He was quite inspired by like avant-garde French writers of the homoerotic, such as Émile Zola and Honoré de Balzac. Those were writers who were writing about lesbians. Again, not in the most flattering way. There was a lot of lesbian exoticism at the time, and I do think that this cultural moment is very much bound up with that as well. Linking lesbians to like vampires, and we see that again with Sheridan Le Fanu, who we're going to talk about in a minute. But Muir did read a lot of this, and I think this really influenced his thinking. In 1895, he published his first short story collection, Celibates, which dealt with themes such as repressed homosexuality and transvestitism, as it would have been called then. His novella, The Singular Life of Albert Nobbs, which was made into a film. I don't know if any of you have seen it, with Glenn Close, set in Dublin. That also explored the life of a cross-dressing woman in Victorian Dublin, and that was quite common as well, women cross-dressing as men in those times for economic reasons, or maybe just because that's just what they like to do. And you actually find an awful lot of records of that type of thing happening. So Havelock Ellis lived in the Temple area of London when George Muir, Edward Martin, Arthur Symonds, and W.B. Yeats all lived there whilst he was working on sexual inversion, and they called themselves boon companions as well at the time. So I think that there was a lot of transmission between these sort of ideas about the scientific rationale for lesbians and how this was being reflected in the literature at the time. So in 1886, Muir published a drama in muslin, which is a very long book, but a very good book. It's set in Galway, and it's a very feminist text, I must say. It's about a group of schoolgirls who are trying to enter the marriage market and sort of realizing that they need to marry well in order to have wealth, and the only way they will survive is to have husbands. And it's actually quite a book that's a lot more, I don't want to say progressive because of what I'm about to tell you. You'll think it's absolutely not progressive. But in terms of putting a spotlight on those issues, it was quite forward thinking in many regards. But there is a character who I'd say one of the very early examples we have of a 19th century Irish lesbian in fiction, and she's called Cecilia. And she's a minor character, but she has a very big impact on the book, I would say. She's in love with her friend Alice. Alice is the sort of good boring girl in the text. It's Cecilia. She feels a love for Alice that's described as wild and visionary and perhaps scarcely sane, and all these words about Cecilia being slightly wild and perhaps not altogether there. There's something slightly crazy about Cecilia, and that's very much been reflected in the medical literature at the time. She's a hunchback as well, and her physical deformity is also, in Mur's thinking, reflective of her sort of abnormal sexual desires. And when we think about how Eugene thought about eugenics and the relationship between how people looked and how they acted, I think Mur is very much feeding into that moment. So Cecilia is described as of a nature more than delicate and sensitive. She shrank from the normal pleasures of love. She shrank from the normal pleasures and loves of life as from the sight of too coarse display of food. Often an ordinary look or word or gesture shocked her, and so deeply that she would remain for hours apart, refusing all consolation. So she's quite a character who feels very deeply, we might say. Cecilia's actions recall the behavior of the hysterical women of the 19th century, women who were actually deemed to be hysterical as a medical condition, prone to sort of passionate fits. Cecilia's teeth gnawed at her lips and her eyes were shot with strange flames. And this whole idea about lesbians having these kind of strange desires, very much taken and ran with when we get to the sort of American publishing in the 1950s. These are where these ideas are really coming from. So Ellis said that female inverts, they really hated men. They didn't just like women, they hated men. And Cecilia absolutely hates men, especially the men that Alice wants to be involved with. So according to Cecilia, women are pure, men are obscene animals. Their love is our degradation. Love, a nice name they give it. How can a sentiment that is merely gratification of the lowest passions be love? And that is all they seek. I know it in their heart of hearts. They despise us. So to talk more about this sort of exploration of how Mur is linking inversion, the medical ideas of inversion to Cecilia, I think this is quite an interesting part. He sort of basically sums up why she is this way, and he says, her hatred of all that concerned sexual passion was consequent on her father's age and her mother's loathing of him during conception and pregnancy. And then if it be considered that this transmitted hatred was planted and left to germinate in a misshaped body, was the almost inevitable psychic characteristic that a human being born under circumstances would possess. So basically, the mother hated the dad, and a hunchback lesbian was the result of that union. So I know that sounds very crazy to us, contemporary readers, but this idea really does is shown throughout quite a lot of the literature, and particularly into the 20th century. So we have a similar rationale in British author Olive Mur's 1930 novel Spleen. In this novel, the main character, Ruth, gives birth to a deformed child. And the reason that the child is deformed in the world of the book is that the mother did not want to have the baby. And then tellingly, Ruth is being described as lonely as an invert. So I think that is a quite telling statement here. Realize I've been talking for for so long on this, but we are going to get to different centuries in a minute. Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, then, he was writing a little bit earlier than George Moore, but he was also not as inspired by this kind of medical thinking as Moore, but still very interested in the relationship between space and lesbian characters. So Le Fanu is described as the father of the modern ghost story. He published an unbelievable amount of novels, short stories. He's a journalist in Dublin as well. Very interested in the occult and things like this. Carmilla, which he published which was a novella, which came within his larger book, In a Glass Darkly, came out in 1872. And Carmilla, according to, I can't remember the name of that scholar, it'll come back to me. She's described as one of the few self-accepting homosexuals in Victorian or any literature. So you're probably thinking that sounds incredibly progressive. But I hate to tell you that Carmilla's actually a vampire. So I think we can sort of temper the limits of this progressiveness, I suppose. So I want to move on, talk about a couple of other authors that I write about in my book. So moving on then into the 20th century, we have Limerick-born Kate O'Brien. Kate O'Brien was born in Limerick. She went to convent school, and that was actually very influential on how she would write about women, and a lot of her books she would continually return to the convent setting. And I think she had this kind of love-hate relationship with the nuns of the convent as well. She moved to Manchester. She was a journalist. Then she moved to London, where she eventually became a playwright, and the Basque region of Spain. She was a governess in Spain during her early years. That would prove to be very influential for O'Brien, and she would write a lot about Spain, and not always in a very favorable way, to the extent that she was banned from Spain. But so she was very critical of the regime in Spain in the 1930s. She associated with a sub-Bloomsbury group of intellectuals, independent women, as they would have been known, women in a sort of Boston marriage, which meant sort of educated women who might have been at university at that time, women's colleges, that sort of thing. A lot of this would have included lesbians and bisexuals. This climate was very important for her work, and in particular her depiction of female autonomy and sexuality. And her books were incredibly forthright in their depictions of sexuality, particularly when you consider the context that her work was being produced in. And I've put a link here to this. It's not a podcast. Is it a podcast? Like a radio talk show? Is that what that's called these days? A discussion on the air on Kate O'Brien, about Kate O'Brien. And it's quite funny because one of the woman who's talking about her hasn't read Kate O'Brien, and she's asking the scholar or librarian or whoever it is, why was Kate O'Brien's work banned? There was one specific line in The Land of Spices why it was banned, and that line was, she saw Etienne and her father in the embrace of love. And the woman who's never read Kate O'Brien's like, that doesn't sound so bad. Why is that worthy of being banned? And then the librarian's like, well, Etienne is a man and her father's a man. So she's talking about two men in 1937. So that's quite a funny part within that talk. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of context that Kate O'Brien was writing in. I'll not read all this out because it's quite a lot of information, but you can it just shows you that at the time when she was writing about these relationships between women in a very frank and open way, it was against this backdrop of very regressive laws against women as well. 1929 Censorship of Publications Act, and that was when 1,200 books were banned in Ireland that were deemed inappropriate or obscene. A lot of foreign literature, things like Lolita and other, non-Irish authors, their books were banned. And unfortunately, two of Kate O'Brien's books were banned as well, which was very difficult for her. So Mary Lavelle, which was the first time I actually encountered a lesbian in literature, which is unbelievable. There's blatant references actually to lesbians in this book and in her later book, As Music and Splendor, which was actually her last book, I believe. Whereas she was also writing about gay male characters in Without My Cloak and The Land of Spices. And The Land of Spices is set in a convent as well. So Mary Lavelle, there's a governess, and towards the end of the book, she reveals she's actually in love with another governess. It's all about these Irish governesses working in Spain. And she says, I like you the way a man would. I can't see your face without wanting to touch it. It's very direct. She's comparing herself to a heterosexual desire. There's nothing very liminal concealed in a statement like that, you might say. And then this is the line that would have The Land of Spices banned. She saw Etienne and her father in the embrace of love. So Kate O'Brien, in a way, didn't really care who she was annoying. She was quite honest and open about lesbians and desire, and I wouldn't say that her work's altogether free from sort of more negative stereotyping, but I think we can sort of see a shift in a way. Now here's the bit that Siobhan and Molly have been waiting for when we talk about the well of loneliness. So we can't get through a talk on lesbian literature without talking about this book. So The Well of Loneliness came out in 1928, which was nearly 10 years before Mary Lavelle was published. And I think there's interesting comparisons that can be drawn between the two books. So Radcliffe Hall was very famous already off the success of the first book. She then said, I'm going to publish. She phoned up her publisher and said, I'm going to publish a new book. I don't know how it's going to go. I need you to take a risk and take a chance with this. The publisher said, okay. Initially, this book received mixed reviews, and the book was about a woman called Stephen Gordon, and she's in love with other women. And I mean, again, I would say it's very much within that Havelock Ellis man trapped in a woman's body idea. I think we could read this more as like a transgender book than a lesbian book, but I think it can be put in both those categories. But anyway, initially it received quite mixed reviews. However, then the editor of the Sunday Express, who absolutely hated it, he said he would rather give a healthy boy or a healthy girl a phial of prussic acid than this novel. So this began a very difficult time. Radcliffe Hall, the book was brought the book was accused of obscenity and a risk to sort of morals, a risk to the morals of the general public. The book was censored solely because of its subject matter and also the personal trials of Radcliffe Hall's own life as well. So I would really read this book, though, as a sort of defense for inversion. And I think maybe that's why the book has carried such a long history. In the one way, you can say it's a very depressing book about lesbians, and it paints a very bleak picture. In another way, it's a book that asks for acceptance. It's a book that, you know, it's trying to create empathy in a way. At least that's how I read it. Havelock Ellis wrote the foreword, so you can really see how Hall was very much wanting to sort of make a defense for, you know, invert what she termed as inverts. Didn't actually get republished in Britain until 1959. There's so much more to say, but I realize I've talked for a very, very long time. So I will try to be quicker in my speech over the next few slides. But basically, economic freedom and access to these sort of growing lesbian communities in Europe during this time did offer some women writers greater freedom to explore homoerotic themes in their work during the 1920s and 1930s. So Radcliffe Hall was a very, very wealthy person, and in a way, she was able to sort of risk this public exclusion in the way that maybe others weren't. Kate O'Brien was in this category. Her income as a journalist, playwright, and author allowed her more freedom to write about taboo subjects. Hall's contemporaries, such as Virginia Woolf, Duja Barnes, Gertrude Stein, and D.H., they wrote less transparently or less in keeping with the dictates of narrative realism than Hall, but nonetheless composed and published works with recognizably homoerotic undertones during the obscenity trial. So I would say that even though the obscenity trial obviously put lesbianism into the public consciousness more so than ever before, writers were still not scared to write about this. And, you know, we got to remember, it wasn't really that long ago since the Oscar Wilde trials that we're going to be hearing about tomorrow night. So these writers were actually taking big risks, I think, when we think about the climate and how LGBT themes are being received at large. That is the line that caused so much of annoyance. Stephen bent down and kissed Mary's hands very humbly, for now she could find no words anymore, and that night they were not divided. When you think, I want to just contrast this to Mary Lavelle, Kate O'Brien's book, and just to really repeat it. And she says, "I like you the way a man would. I can't see your face without wanting to touch it." So, I mean, I would say that Mary Lavelle is just as, if not more, direct in her representation of, like, you know, female desire. So I think that that's just quite interesting to compare these two things. Moving on very quickly, I only have 3 slides left. Ed O'Brien, well, moving on about 30 years later, Ed O'Brien, very, very famous female Irish author, probably not known for her depictions of lesbians, but she did write, she did have a few novels where she described lesbians. They're sadly the ones no one knows about. She was denounced in the pulpits for her exploration of female sexuality in the Country Girls trilogy. And like Kate O'Brien, her works were banned as well. Pretty much everything she did in the 1960s was banned. 1969, the Archbishop of Dublin, John Charles McQuaid, described her work as a smear on Irish womanhood due to the sexual content of her works. And apparently O'Brien's mum also thought of her work that way and would take a pen and, like, edit all the things in her book that she didn't agree with. She didn't really get a lot of support, you know, even within her own family. Lesbian themes are in 2 of her short stories. One of her less known novels, The High Road, which came out in the 80s. Sadly, that is the one novel that she says she actually didn't like. But I think it's a brilliant novel, regardless of what the author thinks. I like it. So, but I do think actually it is quite an interesting book. So moving on, then Emma Donoghue, she's publishing in a very different context. She starts publishing her first books in the early 90s. You think of like Irish lesbian fiction, you probably think of Emma Donoghue. You know, she's enjoyed this sort of reputation as the face of Irish lesbian fiction. But the context she was writing in was just obviously very different to a lot of the earlier authors we've explored. Her literature was sold and specifically marketed as lesbian. You know, this is a book about lesbians in a way that the other books weren't. You know, lesbian was becoming a kind of marketable thing at the time. You know, big publishers were more willing to publish LGBTQ themes. Mary Dorsey, who I talk about in the book and who have given talks on before, you know, her first books came out with small independent feminist presses, not a massive readership. Big publishers were more willing to publish books about lesbians at this time. The mass media was just becoming more interested in these themes. And I think it's interesting to think about the TV shows and sort of other representation that was going on at this time. So things like Coronation Street had gay characters, Queer as Folk, if anyone remembers that, Will and Grace, which ended in 2006 and randomly reappeared recently, Friends. All these things were being broadcast in Ireland thanks to RTE having deals with big American networks and just a more general Americanization of our country. And a lot of this was talking about gay men, but there was an increased interest in lesbian visibility. 2001 saw the first ever lesbian kiss aired on primetime TV when Willow kissed a woman in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I remember this really well, and I'm sure a lot of you watching also do as well. So Emma Donoghue's early novels, they were very much concerned with trying to like correct this historical misrepresentation, stereotyping of like the mannish lesbian. So that's why I wanted to start this talk with this scientific element. Because unfortunately, lesbians have been accused of being like manly and butch, and I wanted to sort of show sort of where those ideas came from and how they were being put into the literature at this time. Emma Donoghue's her early books are very much like, no, lesbians aren't like this. And she's even said in interviews that she thinks her books are a little bit too preachy in that regard. But you know, it was an important thing to do, I think, because there was a lot of cultural stereotyping. At that time as well, you know, there were an awful lot of other writers in England, particularly writing about lesbian themes. You have people like Jeanette Winterson, Sarah Maitland, and some scholars think that these writers really did pave the way for Emma Donoghue to become so popular. I'd be very keen and hear what Kirsty thinks on that as well, if Kirsty is still here. I could have gone on, but I'm worried that you probably don't want me to go on because I've talked for so long. The final chapter, I'm looking at more contemporary literature, and I didn't want this talk to be seen as some sort of definitive overview, or the book even to be seen as definitive overview, because it's not claiming to be that. There's people I can't fit in. There's people that have not been mentioned in this talk, but I didn't want you to think I wasn't aware of them. So I've made a list of people. This left hand is meant to represent earlier 20th century writers, and then the more contemporary authors as well. I also do a chapter on Northern Irish lesbian authors, and I would love more information if anyone has any about them, because it's quite hard to find, to be honest. And I hope that you've enjoyed this, that it's proved somewhat interesting, and I'm very open to any feedback and further queries or comments. So thank you, Mary Ellen, for asking me to be involved in this as well.
No problem. That was really enjoyable. Thanks, Amy. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Kirsty, go ahead.
Yes, I just have to say, is my microphone working, first of all? Just asking. Right, okay. Thank you so much for that talk, Amy. It was an absolute pleasure hearing this discussion about the pathologization of, lesbianism and female sexuality and the like, and how lesbian writers have responded to it. It was really, really insightful, and thank you so much for talking to us about it. Of course, I do have to mention Emma Donoghue. But I just wanted to ask, so you mentioned there about this idea of space and liminality, and I'm sure you're aware, but there's a book called The Apparitional Lesbian, and it was written by Terry Castle. And basically the idea behind that is basically this notion of, because lesbianism and female sexuality just generally was never taken that seriously, it kind of persists in most texts, whether they be texts written by heterosexual writers or lesbian writers or etc. Would you say that that idea of the apparitional lesbian is very persistent in most Irish women's writings, not just Irish lesbian women's writings, but also heterosexual women's writings? And I was thinking mainly of Donoghue's early novels like Hood, but would you say that it's present in other writers?
I think so. And yeah, I mean, Terry Castle's been very influential on anything to do with lesbian literature, hasn't she?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, if you think about a book like Hood, there's so many like liminal images, aren't there?
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, for those that haven't read Hood, it's about a woman and her lover dies, and it's like a series of flashbacks, and the lover is almost like a ghost, almost kind of. She's existing and she's dead, but there's flashbacks. So she's on this like liminal plane.
Yeah.
So I think that I definitely think Emma Donoghue's writing within that sort of trajectory that Castle's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like heterosexual authors, I'm not sure really. But it would be an interesting thing to think about. And I know that Moira Casey takes Terry Castle's work as like a main focus in her PhD as well. And I talk about actually Terry Castle wrote an interesting book called, what's it called? Mustn't have been that interesting.
Yeah, hold on, I'll have a wee look. I'll just have a look here.
It's something about, oh gosh, it's about Masquerade.
Yes, Masquerade and Civilization.
Yes. Yeah.
There we go.
And in Carmilla, which I didn't really talk about very much, there's a scene where Carmilla goes to like a masquerade ball and pretends to not be a vampire.
Yeah.
And I think that what Terry Castle's talking about, the liminal space and how that's configured within those spaces, I think that's quite interesting. So yeah, to sum that up, yes, I do think that Terry Castle's idea about the apparitional lesbian are quite interesting. But I suppose the other part of that is that she's also saying they've been apparitional, but they've also been in like the midst of everywhere. I think that's an interesting thing to think about as well. So for example, in Mary Lavelle, which is mostly a very heterosexual story, there's this lesbian who just appears in the middle of the story. So this idea that they're also kind of they're like evased, but also like in the midst of everything, I think that's quite an interesting concept. So hopefully that's
a good answer. Thank
helpful.
you, Amy. Thank you.
Okay.
Have you read or are familiar with the work by Marina Carr? She's an Irish playwright, and she would kind of go into that whole space concept because it's theatre, so like theatre and space is a big thing. But like one of my favorite lines is a character arrives and it's the character Death basically, and he comes on stage, he sees the character and he says, "I'm too previous," and then walks off again. And that's him basically saying, "I'm too early." And it's that whole play. It's a retelling of Medea, but as an Irish like retelling, and it really confronts the Irish stereotypes of women and what women are expected to be and what happens when they're not like that. And it really delves into that whole like space and time and where does our conscious exist versus where do we exist. And it's, if you haven't looked into it, I'd suggest looking into it.
What was that play called?
By the Bog of Cats.
Yes, that's funny because I can see it in my mind. I was reading a book on liminality in like Irish culture at large, and I do remember seeing that because it's such an interesting title.
Yeah,
and there was an article called like liminal space in the Bog of Cats. I should read that. You never know when someone's going to ask you about that.
Well, like obviously, like whenever you're doing theatre, your whole thing is about time and space and like your unities of time. And so whenever you start talking about that, I was like, oh my God, I know this. I understand this. I'm so excited.
I think like obviously liminality, be easy to think of it in a sort of very academic context, but I've noticed this quite a lot. Liminality as a concept is quite in our cultural consciousness in a lot of things. So I saw a magazine the other day and it was something liminal space. No, it wasn't an academic magazine, it was just a magazine for anyone. And even like talk about the pandemic, and we're in this like sort of post-pandemic world, like all these ideas we've been talking about liminality but not realizing we've been talking about liminality in a way. People have been saying, oh, the last 2 years haven't existed, the last 2 years have been on pause. I mean, that's the ultimate liminal space, isn't it? It's nice when what you do has a sort of relevance. When you work in the arts and you're always being told to make your work more relevant. Here it is.
Well, I'm looking for topics to do my dissertation on, so I might have to like pinch the lesbian representation and erasure and discuss that, but from a lawyer perspective. So I might be coming to you for more information about that.
Great. That sounds much more employable than the path I took.
Elspeth has just thrown up a wee comment. I think she may have had to leave there. Just thanking you. Fascinating talk. She took loads of notes and can't wait to read your book.
Brilliant. Thanks. The one thing I would say is, and I had no say in this, is the book is quite expensive because, well, like you're an academic publisher, it's been published to the academic market. It will be bought in bulk by libraries. So for individuals, it is quite dear. I'm not sure I've ever bought a book at the price of this book. But if you do want it, I would say, and you're not affiliated with a university, you can ask your library's NI to order it in, and they probably will. So, because if they can find books that have some sort of cultural value, they will order books in. So if you want to get it but you don't want to buy it, because I understand it's dear and I'm seeing very little of that money because that's academic publishing. I would highly recommend you ask a local library to order it in for you, because that is what local libraries exist for, and they do have a very large Irish studies section, particularly in Belfast. So yeah, please talk to your librarian.
That's a great idea, because you're still getting book sales in if the library buys the books.
Yep, absolutely.
And we're not all from Belfast on screen, so we should probably be encouraging our local libraries to do so.
Yeah, well, I'm not in Belfast either. So yeah, get wherever your library is, ask. All they can say is no.
And Siobhan has raised her hand. Do you have a wee comment or question, Siobhan?
Yeah, just a quick one. I just want to go back to the Well of Loneliness and the whole invert title, and you think that whole theory and that whole study over time has changed from just a masculine presenting, butch lesbian into potentially a trans issue. You think potentially they were writing about, like, potentially, do you think Radcliffe Hall was writing about a trans man as opposed to a butch lesbian, which my understanding is more self-identifying with herself?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that the character in Stephen sees themselves as a man. So I would and when you think about inversion theory, which was saying basically lesbians are men in the wrong body, I would see it maybe more as a sort of trans book as opposed to like a butch lesbian book. But I had,
I think I'd be
it
interested.
Can occupy both,
Yeah, I think I'd be interested to go back and read it again. I mean, it's probably 20 years since I read it, and it was really, really hard going. It's a really hard book to read. It's very heavy going.
It is heavy, yeah, and long.
But I think I'd be interested to reread it now through, a new perspective of intersectionality and things, so much more. Like, I had no clue about transgender issues back then. You know what I mean? And knew nobody with that lived experience or anything. So yeah, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. It is quite a yeah, it's a hard book to read, but also quite a good book. And the character's so likable. And I think that was one of the strengths of Radcliffe Hall's writing as well, to take what would have been seen as very monstrous in society and make it into something that you can relate to.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite an interesting book.
And I think the idea of butch being a slur, and that I think that has turned around as well in recent times. Like, I personally, I'm a proud butch lesbian. I know lots of proud butch dykes out there, kind of thing, that retain that identity, and there is more space for that nowadays as well than there would have been back then. There was obviously a negative, a negative, using the whole mannish thing.
Yeah,
said as a negative thing back then to people, even though people, clearly, and in Victorian times, enjoyed walking around in lovely tailored suits and dressing as men, and were clearly butch lesbians at the time, and probably didn't give a hoot. You're recording a hoot about what people thought of them. Which is essentially, which is quite a kind of a proud butch ethos as well to carry.
Yeah, I mean, you would probably be interested in a book by Jack Halberstam, who wrote In a Queer Time and Place. Their first book came out in 1998, Female Masculinity.
And I've heard of it. Haven't read it, but yeah, I've heard it referred to a lot.
Fantastic cover.
Yeah,
and it's sort of about the evolution of the butch lesbian and the masculine woman, and how those two things are like connected. And she's talking a lot about like societal attitudes towards butchness and that. So I think you'd be quite interested. It is. It's an interesting.
I've heard that referred to before. Another one for the reading list. Must read more.
I see in the chat that Sarah or Alex has made a comment. Do you want to share your comment with us all? Sarah or Alex, or are you happy enough for it to be in the chat?
Oh, hi, Mary Ellen. No, happy to share it.
Good stuff. Go ahead.
And that's Alex speaking. Don't expect you to recognize me by my voice.
Oh, I do. It's the American accent.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to say, yeah, great presentation, Amy. And I'm an anthropologist, so I had to laugh a couple times because there's a feel in the field of anthropology of wanting to move on from liminality.
Hope for my sake they don't.
No, but I'm working on my PhD at Queen's right now with regards to non-binary gender identity and the use of space and how to talk about what space I'm actually trying to get at and trying to articulate. So using terms like built environment and gendered spaces, because those of us who navigate cultural spaces, et cetera, as lesbians and as ones with different gender identity, we kind of inherently pick up on what different spaces feel like and how they operate, but translating that into academic terms is fun. So it was helpful to listen to your talk tonight. And it was just saying, the historical aspects I always find really useful. I mean, it was so fascinating as you talked about the inversion and some of the other pieces, and to see where a lot of bigotry and harassment and those aspects have those roots, in the 1800s and early 1900s, which is common with a lot of our political issues. So I'm always curious how academia and thinking and theorizing moves on, and then watching how it takes time in the non-academic cultural spaces for that to shift and embrace new concepts. So that was, just wanted to say thank you. That was great, and it was wonderful to learn a bit more about the history of Albert Nobbs. That it was a novella to begin with, but I certainly enjoyed the film when it came out. So, thank you. Did you have anything to add, Sarah? Thank you. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And if you've not read it, I think you'd enjoy the in a queer time and space that I referenced at the start, because that's just what Halberstam's talking about, this whole relationship between queerness and space. It's just very interesting, those topics, I think.
Yeah, it's good to hear you would recommend that, because that book certainly stood out to me. So good to know. Thank you. Not that I don't have enough reading to do already, but but Siobhan sounds very interested in doing lots of reading. So perhaps if I farm out some of the reading that I need to do and then just get synopsis from people, then because I am reeling myself back from lots of rabbit holes currently. So
I'm getting used to glasses for the first time in the last year, which is probably the hurdle I've put in my way from the point of view of reading. Too much screens, too many screens. I'm getting used to glasses.
Yes, I have found blue light filtering glasses have made a world of difference in dealing with screens. So just a total aside there. Thanks again, Amy.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Just a quick thing for Siobhan, chatting about like the lesbians walking around in their suits in like Victorian era. I'm nearly sure, I could be wrong, but when women would have went out hunting with horses, what jacket color they wore had different meanings. So like black was like married, blue was looking for love. If you wore a flower on this side of you, you were interested in same gender. If you were at this side, you were opposite gender. If you wore your hat a certain way, you were a widow. Like there was so much reading into how they presented and how they dressed. And so that's where kind of the green carnation came in as well, to do with Oscar. Just saying.
Okay, well, just before we finish up, and I'll bring Amy back in beforehand, but Molly is doing a wee event for us tomorrow night at 7:30. And it's, what's his name again? Your mom, Finch, your mom. Who is it?
He's just a wee obscure writer. Like, I mean, Emma Donoghue would be more well known than Oscar Wilde, I reckon, you know. He's just a wee lad down the road.
Well, Molly's doing a wee talk and some readings of the wee man down the road's work. So we're calling it Avenging Oscar. And that's on at 7:30 via Zoom. If anybody wants a link, hit me up for an email. I've also put our Survey Monkey in the chat box. As always, please fill in the evaluation. And thank you all for attending tonight. Forgot to say at the start, obviously, this is part of the LGBT Heritage Project, which is in collaboration with Here and I, Rainbow Project and Cara Friend, and very kindly funded through the Heritage Lottery Fund. Had to say that, but I forgot. I think I should know that off by heart by now. But Amy, final words. Just put you on the spot.
Yeah, well, this is it. See, I will think about this when I go to bed tonight, and I'll think, damn, something will come to me later, and I'll be, I should have said that. No, I want to just thank you for inviting me and for everyone who's came, because it's great to see so many people interested in what has often been seen as a very obscure topic. And I would just, here's what I'll say. If you're interested in Radcliffe Hall, Hilary McCollum, who is a local author from here, she is writing a book about Radcliffe Hall. Radcliffe Hall is like a character in her new book, and it's set in World War II, and it's about a all like female lesbian fire brigade. So that is my final thought, that you should seek this out. And I also, and to be completely selfish, I also started a craft business. So check out my crafts online at basicwitchdoctor.com.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Say that again. But
I started a craft business.
that's the name of the website.
Oh, sorry. Basic Witch Doctor. It's on Instagram.
All right, dead on.
But there's my final thoughts.
Your final thoughts, okay, dead on. Edale, if Edale's still here, and Nicola are from our craft group on a Monday night, run by Grunion, Here and I. And I believe Edale also has a craft shop. She does some fantastic stuff there. So maybe she can give you some helpful hints on marketing and things like that. And
Yeah,
if she's not on here, I'll
absolutely.
send her a message and suggest that. Okay, I'm going to stop the
I've just followed the Basic Witch Doctor there, so you can send me a message.
Thank you. Brilliant. What sort of stuff do you do, Adele?
Lots. Lots of different things. At the minute, I'm working on a, I say it's a de-stashing project, but really it's not. I've been hoarding all my scraps for years, and I'm trying to reduce the waste. So it's kind of like a whole eco warrior series that I'm doing, and I'm starting off by making myself an entire jacket out of tiny little hexagons. So
Wow.
you'll see that on my
goodness.
Instagram, and I do it on TikTok as well.
Oh my goodness.
But-
Wow.
Yeah, we don't need this
Brilliant.
recorded though.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. So on the sake of the recording, thank you everybody.